Hi everyone, I'm Rick Beato. I get emails and text messages and things from people from all over the world that have been watching my channel here for the last few months, asking me about how varied the videos are that I do and what my background is. So I figured I'd do a video kind of telling you a bit about myself, since many of you don't really know that much about me unless you follow me on my Facebook page. So anyways, I'm 54 years old. I've been a musician since I was in third grade when I started on the cello. I studied the cello, not really seriously, but in my school that I went to, my elementary school. I'm from Rochester, New York. And the school I went to had a really good music program, the school system I went to. And the orchestra program and band program were really developed. They had all the people there. I think we had 11 full-time faculty that were in our music department at the time. And every one of them had either master's degrees or doctorates. So this was a really knowledgeable, really well-funded school system. And I grew up, I'm from a family of 7 kids. My dad worked for the railroad. My mom worked in a can factory. Music was always a big part of our household, though. I'm the second youngest of 7 kids, and my mom's family, 2 of her sisters were music teachers. One is still teaching, actually. And one of her brothers was a jazz bass player, her brother Al. Really talented. Everybody on my mom's side was really musical. My grandfather, my mom's dad, played guitar and was very talented. I remember him when I was a little kid playing the guitar, me sitting right next to him, right in front of him, and watching his fingers on the fingerboard and being mesmerized by it. My dad was a huge jazz fan. He listened to really progressive bebop, hard bop, things like that. He was into Oscar Peterson, Joe Pass, Ahmad Jamal. He had really eclectic tastes, and I didn't even realize it. Yet he was never a musician, never studied an instrument at all. But in the 50s, he worked in a bar in Rochester called Squeezers, in probably late 40s, early 50s, on the weekends. And it was a jazz bar, and all these famous jazz players would do the circuit from New York City up, and they'd come through Rochester and they'd play there. So he saw everybody play. I mean, he saw Charlie Christian play, and he saw, you name it. Every big name jazz musician would come through Rochester. They'd come up, the circuit would be at New York, and then they'd go play Albany, and then they'd play Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo. Anyway, so he would play jazz records on the weekends nonstop. It just sounded normal to me when I would hear it. You hear me refer to it as high information music on some of my videos. And I was really exposed to that. Not necessarily as a baby, but more when I was just a little bit older, when my dad had more time and he started listening more on the weekends. My dad retired when I was in 10th grade. And so he was around a lot more around the house, and he would play jazz all day. One of our favorite things to do is sit and listen to records. He'd put on a record, we'd sit on each side of the room and listen to one side of a record. I'd go flip it over and listen to the other side and never say a word. My dad would sit there and twirl his hair. He'd twirl a lock of hair in the front like that when he's listening, and he would whistle to it. Even if it was something that he's just hearing for the first time, he'd always whistle along to it. But my dad would whistle along with the most insane bebop melodies, and he wasn't a musician, but he had such a good ear for music. When I was in 7th grade, when I was going into 7th grade, the summer of my 6th grade year, I was playing cello in the orchestra. I didn't really take it seriously at all. But the orchestra teacher came to me and said, I want you to switch to the bass. And I said, okay. They didn't have any bass players, so he took one of the cello players, and it was me. And he said, I want you to play in this chamber orchestra too, and learn. I'm going to give you lessons over the summer. So I started taking bass lessons over the summer and played in this chamber orchestra, and one of the pieces that we worked on was Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 3, which is essentially for string orchestra. I remember getting the music to it and listening to the record. So I'd sit in my living room, and I had my bass at the house, and I would learn the music and play along with the record. And I was really good at reading. I could read the parts without any problem at all. bass was a lot easier than cello, I thought. That started to strengthen my bond with music and really helped my ensemble playing. Ensemble playing was really big in our school. We would have orchestra, I want to say every day of the week. I think we had orchestra. It wasn't like a Monday, Wednesday, Friday thing or 2 days a week. This was like a serious kind of thing. Everybody took a lesson every week with with one of the teachers at school. And many people took private lessons outside of school. So it was not even, it was lessons in school, lessons out of school, and you play in an ensemble every day. There's no substitute for kids playing in an ensemble. There just isn't. And if you play a string instrument, you're constantly listening for pitch. Okay, so that is a really big thing. So anyways, in the summer of my 7th grade year, I broke my ankle really badly. It was the first week of summer. And I was in a cast, and the doctor said you're going to need to be in a cast for at least 3 months. It was a very, very bad break. And I remember it was the 76 Olympics were going on at the time. So I was stuck at home in the summertime with nothing to do, and there was a guitar there that my brother had gotten. It was a really cheap guitar. I don't even know what it was made out of. But I picked it up, and I had a Mel Bay chord book, and I started teaching myself guitar. Now, since I played the cello and the bass, I had the finger dexterity already, so learning the chords was actually pretty easy. I didn't have to go through the callus thing. That was one of the big, big parts of it. And I remember thinking, wow, this is really cool. I can actually play songs. And I started learning songs off records, and this is the mid-'70s. There's a lot of great music coming out, a lot of great guitar music. Bands like the Stones, Zeppelin, the Beatles had just broken up a few years before. It was really a great era to grow up in if you were a guitar player. And I remember becoming really obsessed about the guitar. It was the instrument that I felt a real connection with. So when I took up the guitar, I was particularly obsessed with mastering it. That was kind of the thing. That's my whole trip here is the mastery of music in whatever genre it is. So anyways, I played guitar for a couple years, and then I ran into a guy at a music store, a kid, who asked me to be in a band. And I remember this. He said he played drums, and I remember his older brother was in a band that I really thought was amazing, a rock band, a high school rock band. His brother was a few years older than us, and it's my friend Andy. And Andy gave me a tape. Here's 9 songs to learn. So he didn't say anything about learning them. And back then, you just learned it off the tape. There was just no question about it. Everybody could do that. You just listened to the songs and could play them. So I remember going to a rehearsal at his house. He played drums, and then then I met a guitar player. His name was Pete. His dad was a minister at a church up the street from me. And we started hanging out together every day playing guitar. And I'd bring my guitar up to his place after school. I'd walk. It was about a half mile away. I'd walk up there with my guitar. And I remember learning the pentatonic scale and the blues scale, and he and I would sit and just trade solos for hours and hours and hours, and I was fascinated by it. Anyway, so we put this band together, and we rehearsed all the time. It was great. It was really a really great experience to play in a rock band in high school. And I played in a couple different rock bands, a few different ones. Ended up playing in a punk rock band called the Monroes in the late 70s when punk rock was really big. But one of the pivotal moments in my life is on Christmas when I was in 10th grade. My dad gives me an album for Christmas, and he's like, I open it up, and it's Joe Pass, Virtuoso. I said, what is this? And my dad had listened to Joe Pass, but I said, what is this? He said, this is Joe Pass record. And I remember him saying something like, if you ever learn to play guitar like this, you've accomplished something with your life. Thing. So one day, after a couple months, I opened the record up. I said, let me give it a listen. And I started listening to it, and I remember scanning through this stuff, and it came to the song All the Things You Are. It's all great jazz standards on it. It's still one of the greatest jazz guitar records ever made. And I got to All the Things You Are, and I thought, wow, I wonder if I played... My dad was a really tough guy. He would never, ever compliment you, but he was an incredibly great guy. But he wasn't one of those. He was from that really hardcore generation. He was born in 1919. And anyway, so I remember sitting down during the day. It must have been in the summer, and I sat all day and I learned this Joe Pass Virtuoso, All the Things You Are solo. And my dad came home from work, and I remember sitting there and dropping the needle and saying, check this out. And I started playing along with it. And he said, you figured that out? He couldn't believe that I could sit there and figure out these really difficult chord voicings, bebop lines, all this stuff. And I kind of surprised myself with it that I could figure it out. I mean, it's really advanced. Even till this day, it's very advanced. So I think my dad being impressed with it made an impression on me, and it made me want to impress him even more. So I started practicing every day, and I was really into it. I love the lines. I love the chromaticism in it. And I love the sound of those chords that I had never really heard that much before. So anyways, I got a job mowing lawns for a guy that lived a couple blocks from me. And I remember going into his house and noticing when I went in to get a glass of water and noticing he had a bunch of guitars there. I said, you play guitar? He said, yeah, I own a music store in town. I said, wow, cool. What's it called? He says, Rizzo Music. His name was Tom Rizzo. So Tom said, you play guitar? And I said, yeah. So he said, play me something. So I played some bebop stuff, some Joe Pass stuff that I figured out. And he said, wow, sounds great. You should take guitar lessons at my store. He showed me some stuff then. He played for me, and he was unbelievably good. I mean, I was really blown away by it. I'd never heard anyone play like that live. I mean, jazz guitar. And then he said, why don't you come up to the store? I'll give you a couple lessons. So I went up there, and I took 2 lessons with Tom. And so this was set in 1978. So I was 10th grade still. And I took 2 lessons with Tom, and then he set me up with a guitar teacher named Mark Mineta, who's no longer with us. And Mark was a great jazz guitar player. His dad actually was friends with Joe Pass, and Mark actually had played with Joe Pass before. So I remember the first day I was there, I was waiting for my lesson with Mark, and Mark was out in the lobby, and he was waiting for another student who hadn't shown up. So he grabs a guitar, and I have my guitar out, I'm playing. He goes, here, check this out. And he starts teaching me this thing. And in 15 minutes, he taught me the melody to Donna Lee by Charlie Parker. He just taught me phrase by phrase, and I memorized it. And he was shocked that I could memorize the whole thing right then. I didn't think anything of it. We just went phrase by phrase, and I just memorized it. So I took lessons with Mark for about a year, and then he got a road gig somewhere, and then I started taking lessons with a guy named Glenn Cummings, who's a left-handed guitar player. And that was really interesting because Glenn's guitar would be going the opposite way of mine. So Glenn was a really good jazz guitar player as well. And he got me into improvising more, playing jazz, and taught me about playing over 2-5-1 progressions and things like that, minor 2-5s. And it wasn't just where I was taking stuff off records. Now it was like, he said to me, you need to learn how to play over these tunes. So he was very big into improvising. This progressed through my junior and senior year. And then I remember saying, I want to go to school for music. The only way to go to school for music back then, there were 2 ways actually. Now I was playing in the high school orchestra. I sat first chair bass, and I was a really good bass player. I went and auditioned at a couple schools. I ended up doing my undergrad at Ithaca College in upstate New York for guitar, jazz guitar. But it was jazz guitar music theory. So in the first week of school, I said, well, I want to keep playing the bass. So I went to the bass professor and I auditioned for him, Henry Newbert. And he said, why don't you be a bass major? Why are you being a jazz guitar major? That'll fit much better with music ed. What are you going to do with a degree with jazz guitar? You can't really do that and do music ed. So I switched to bass. Well, I was actually a double major. It was bass and jazz guitar, classical bass, jazz guitar. So I ended up getting my music ed degree from Ithaca College. And in music ed, you have to take all these different instruments. You take class piano, you take clarinet, you take trumpet, you take trombone, you take all these things. And then because I was in the string program, the college, Ithaca College, was affiliated with the Suzuki Institute, which was right off campus. And they had teachers that specialized, their music ed string program specialized into teaching Suzuki strings. So one of the other things that happened actually on the first day of school, my freshman year, is I met my friend Paul Smith. Now Paul and I became roommates our sophomore year, and he was one of the most knowledgeable people that I had ever met about jazz records and jazz in general. He wasn't just knowledgeable about jazz, he was knowledgeable about all different genres of music. And when we lived together, he had this incredibly great jazz record collection, far better than anyone that I had ever seen before. And he lugged all these records to Ithaca, and we lived in this apartment off campus and called Hudson Heights. We would listen to records all day, put headphones on, whatever. But his dad was a painter and painted this massive picture of John Coltrane that we had in our apartment. And every day you'd wake up and you see this huge, I'm talking, it's like 4 feet by 4 feet painting of John Coltrane. Great painting. Paul and I are still friends to this day. I talk to him all the time, and he is a really gifted musician. But what was interesting about he and I is that we weren't just interested in jazz. We were both interested in classical music as well. And he started out as a jazz guitar player, but then turned to a classical guitar major. And then he went on and got his master's degree in jazz piano because he taught himself how to play piano at night in the practice rooms well enough to go to Cal Arts and get a master's degree. He was from Rochester also. This is what was amazing, is that we both liked jazz, really sophisticated jazz, and we both liked classical music, modern classical music. So that was a really important time for me. Was Paul and I kind of feeding off each other musically. It was we played a lot of gigs together in college, and he's one of the first people that I met that I had this connection with. So Paul and I lived together our sophomore year, and then he ended up leaving school and coming back later after I'd left. But head of the jazz department there, who was my teacher, my jazz guitar teacher, his name was Steve Brown, and Steve was very influential to me. Steve was a great improviser and just a fantastic musician. We're still friends. So my junior year of college, I got my own 2 Suzuki violin students, and they were 2 4-year-old kids. And we taught them Mississippi Hop Dog and all the things that you teach in Suzuki violin. And I remember I wasn't a violinist, but I could play violin well enough to teach these little kids. I mean, I had to practice the violin and the viola and the cello. I took classes in all these instruments, and I practiced them all the time. So one of the things I started doing some orchestration videos last night. I did my first one, and it's interesting because a couple of people have written to me and asked me about how do I know about orchestration. And well, I mean, I used to conduct a big band when I was a college professor, but I played in orchestra for years and years and years. And being a string player, I got my undergrad degree in that. So you have to understand bowings. You have to understand, ensemble playing. I played in string orchestras. I've done everything. Plus, as a producer, I've written string arrangements and conducted them with string players. And as far as the brass playing and orchestration, conducting a big band for a few years, for 5 years or so, you understand brass and wind instruments. Big band conducting is really tough, actually, because there's a lot of tricky rhythms you have to know. You have to really be an expert on articulations and things like that. So when I'm doing the orchestration, talking about orchestration, I was equally at home with brass instruments as I was with string instruments. And as far as the brass playing and orchestration, conducting a big band for a few years, for 5 years or so, you understand brass and wind instruments. Big band conducting is really tough, actually, because there's a lot of tricky rhythms you have to know. You have to really be an expert on articulations and things like that. So when I'm doing the orchestration, talking about orchestration, I was equally at home with brass instruments as I was with string instruments. So after finishing my undergrad, I decided to go get my master's, and I went to New England Conservatory in Boston. I got 2 assistantships when I was there. My one was being the assistant to the department chair, who was Miroslav Vitus, who was actually the original bass player of Weather Report and played with Miles Davis back in the 60s. Miroslav was a pretty crazy bass player originally from Czechoslovakia, as it was at the time. And then I was the assistant to the Big Bang conductor, Pat Hollenbeck, at the time. But one of the most amazing things that happened when I got to Boston happened on the second day I was there. I was taking the train, and I got there a couple days before school started, and decided to take the train in from where I was living outside of town. And the T stop, the T is what you call the subway in Boston, even though it's not really, doesn't go sub very often. I got off right near Berkeley, and I'm walking past Berkeley. New England Conservatory is about 2 blocks from Berkeley, so I'm walking past and I hear some playing going on at this cafe literally across the street from Berkeley. There's a Starbucks there right now on Mass Ave. And there's a bunch of people standing outside. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, so I walk over there and I look in the window and I see a jazz group playing. So I said, wow, what is this? These are obviously Berkeley students, and all the kids that are watching were Berkeley. So I go in and hear the sax player playing this unbelievably great solo. And the band was just cooking, and I'd never heard anyone play like this. The guys back in Ithaca could not play like this. And then there was this keyboardist with this huge afro there, and it came time for a keyboard solo, and this guy took the most ridiculous solo I'd ever heard. I'd never heard anything like it. And it turned out to be Aiden Essen, who some of you know from me talking about Aiden on my channel and seeing some of his videos. The sax player was a guy named Donnie McCaslin, and Donnie is, I want to say, is at New England Conservatory now. He's a jazz professor, maybe at Berkeley. These guys were students at the time. So I'm standing there watching this, and I remember going back and telling my roommate at the time, who was also a jazz guitar player back in Boston, that he said, "Did you go into town?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "You can't believe these players here. I heard these guys that just blew my mind." And I said, "This keyboard player played the greatest solos I've ever heard." And he said, "Well, who is he?" I said, "I have no idea. I'm going to go back and find him tomorrow." So the next day, I search all the practice rooms at Berkeley, and I finally see this big head of hair rehearsing with a trio, and I heard that sound, and I waited till they were done. I knocked on the door, and I went and introduced myself. I said, "Hey, I'm Rick." And he said, "My name's Aiden," and he had a heavy accent. So I said, "Where are you from?" He says, "Turkey." So Aiden had been there at Berkeley for about a year or so, maybe not even a year. And Aiden was another person that was one of the biggest influences in my life. He was the real inspiration for me coming up with the idea to play music for my kids, and for Dylan first in particular. It was Aiden's music, that improvisations that I recorded back in the mid to late 80s of Aiden, that I wanted to see if you played this music for a baby, if it would sound normal to them. And you have all seen, or many of you have seen Dylan's videos, and you know about Dylan's ear. So Aiden's music is, to me, directly responsible for that. I played other stuff too, but really Aiden's music, I think, was the thing that completely changed Dylan's brain. Especially the music that Aiden had done at that time, because that was the music that I had to play Dylan. So I ended up going to school there for 2 years. I got my master's degree. Aiden and I played many gigs together, and I played with a lot of the, all the best known Boston jazz musicians. And at New England, you had to take mostly classical classes. There wasn't a lot of jazz classes, although one of my professors was George Russell, who wrote the book, The Lydian Chromatic Concept of Tonal Organization. And George, it was funny, it was an interesting class. Aiden was in the class, John Medeski was in the class, a guy named Rob Sheps was in the class. And we would write pieces and play them every week. People would come up and play with small groups. You write you write a lead sheet out, and people come up and improvise. And George would have you write specific kind of pieces. And George would always tell me, one day you're going to write a hit song. And I always used to be embarrassed by that and insulted that he would say I'd write a hit song, meaning, like, what do you mean? I can't write weird melodies? Little did I know that that was a compliment coming from George. So then I ended up going on and getting a teaching gig at Ithaca College, where I taught for 5 years until I left to try to make it as a rock musician. I got signed to a publishing deal in 1991 to Polygram Publishing. I then moved to Atlanta after moving around everywhere. And I've been here for 22 years now. And I started producing bands. In 1995, I produced my first band called the Tender Idols. But I didn't really understand anything about recording. That I didn't learn until about the year 2000 or so. So I always had to work with engineers. In the meantime, I was in a band that got signed, which was one of my, this is kind of how, through the 90s, I learned about recording and songwriting. That was kind of the next thing to master after I quit my college teaching gig of 6 years at Ithaca. So I got a record deal that ended up being a complete disaster. Our label, we spent about $483,000 on a record. We had a producer that was drunk all the time that never showed up, and it was a terrible experience. But what it did was it made me want to learn about how to record myself so I'd never get stuck in a position like that again. So I taught myself recording and engineering by reading magazines and asking questions. And I've been lucky enough to do records. I've had a couple platinum records, a couple gold records, a #1 song as a songwriter. And I've got a publishing deal with Sony Publishing. So during the last, really full-time for the last 17 years, I've been a music producer. And that's why you see me do these videos on engineering and production and mixing, and as well as all of my things on music theory, because I taught music theory. And I remember I subbed on a semester when for Iden was teaching at the New School in 1988. Substituted for him because he took a road gig, and I taught for a whole semester there. And I want to say that Brad Meldau was going to school then. He was probably in my class. I didn't even realize it. Anyways, so one of the reasons when I had children and I started playing them this music that I always loved, this, modern classical music and modern jazz music, it reinvigorated my love of that music, and that's all I wanted to listen to again. And this is one of the reasons why I'm doing these videos here, was to give back and try and get other people, give them a view into my world and the great, rich environment I was lucky enough to be immersed in as a musician in my teens and through my college experience. I mean, I've been incredibly fortunate to have run into these people that are just some of the most gifted people. And I make these videos so that I can kind of download or maybe it's upload my brain to YouTube or to, for my kids in the future, and get all these ideas that I have out. So anyways, that's my story. And I'd love to hear from you guys. Anything that you'd like for me to talk about in these videos. I have thousands I want to make. All I need is time. So that's all for now. Thank you for being here for me, and it's been really great. And I've heard some great stories from some incredibly great people. I'm Rick Beato.